A quiet shift is unfolding in Burkina Faso's food system. In a country long dependent on imported fish feed, new industrial units have just begun operating while national fish production already approaches 60,000 tons on the way to an ambitious 100,000-ton target set under the current agropastoral offensive. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, this push toward domestic fish production is being framed not only as an economic initiative, but also as a strategic move tied to food security, jobs, and national self-reliance. But the real question is this: could these factories quietly reshape how Burkina Faso feeds itself? Something important is unfolding behind a seemingly technical announcement. In Burkina Faso, new industrial units producing fish feed have begun operating, while the country's fish output already stands near 60,000 tons, moving toward a national target of 100,000 tons within the government's broader agropastoral initiative. For observers following the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, this development may signal more than agricultural progress, touching food security, employment, and the country's long effort to reduce dependence on imported inputs. Understanding what is happening here may reveal a deeper shift in how Burkina Faso plans to feed its own population in the years ahead. The first sign that something larger was unfolding appeared in a single number. Burkina Faso's fish production has already reached roughly 60,000 tons, moving steadily toward a national objective of 100,000 tons under the country's current agropastoral offensive. That gap between where the country stands today and where it aims to go reveals the scale of the transformation now underway. To understand why that number matters, it helps to look at the obstacle that had been slowing the sector for years. Fish farming itself was expanding across the country. Floating cages had begun appearing on nearly 20 reservoirs and dams, and more private operators were entering the field. Yet one basic constraint kept limiting growth: the availability of affordable, locally produced fish feed. Without reliable feed, fish farming becomes expensive and unpredictable. Many producers had to rely on imported feed, which meant higher costs, supply delays, and vulnerability to global market fluctuations. That single dependency quietly shaped the limits of the entire industry. This is why the inauguration of new feed production units in Bobo-Dioulasso carries strategic weight. These facilities are designed to produce fish feed domestically, making it more accessible and less costly for operators who are raising fish across the country. Alongside the unit in Bobo-Dioulasso, another similar facility is planned in Bagré, expanding production capacity even further. The broader objective is simple in theory but powerful in practice: strengthen the entire fish production chain from inside the country rather than relying on external supply. Under initiatives promoted during the leadership period associated with Ibrahim Traoré, the government has emphasized increasing endogenous production in sectors tied directly to food security. Once fish feed becomes locally available at stable prices, the effects ripple outward. Fish farmers can expand operations with more predictable costs. Reservoirs that previously supported small-scale activity can host larger cage systems. Gradually, the production curve can climb toward the 100,000-ton national target. The early signals already suggest momentum. Operators who invested in fish farming did so partly because they believed the state would support the infrastructure required to sustain the industry. With these feed factories now entering service, that expectation begins to take concrete form. And this is where the story becomes more interesting than it first appeared. What initially looked like a simple industrial launch begins to resemble the foundation of a broader shift in how the country approaches food production and economic resilience. To understand why these factories matter, it helps to look at the people positioned closest to the transformation. Within the country's agricultural administration and development programs, officials overseeing the agropastoral initiative have repeatedly emphasized that the fish sector holds unusual potential for both food supply and employment growth. Their perspective acts as a kind of guide through the larger strategy now unfolding. One early signal came from operators already working on reservoirs where floating fish cages had been introduced. Over the past few years, these producers began experimenting with larger cage systems in nearly 20 dam locations across the country. the technical conditions were promising. Local demand for fish remained strong, but again and again, producers ran into the same barrier, the constant availability of feed. Several operators described a similar experience. They could expand their cages, they could raise more fish, yet imported feed often arrived late or at prices that sharply reduced profitability. As a result, growth across the sector remained uneven, even though the underlying potential was clear. The launch of domestic feed production begins to change that equation. With factories now operating in Bobo-Dioulasso and another unit planned for Bagré, the supply chain supporting fish farmers may become far more stable. Instead of relying entirely on imported inputs, producers gain access to feed manufactured inside the country. This shift does more than lower costs, it creates confidence. When entrepreneurs believe the supply chain will remain reliable, they are far more willing to invest in expanding production. That is precisely the dynamic officials hope to trigger within the broader agro-pastoral offensive. Supporters of the initiative often connect this approach to the leadership direction associated with Ibrahim Traoré, where strengthening domestic production systems is framed as a path toward food sovereignty and economic resilience. The feed factories represent more than industrial facilities. They become strategic infrastructure. From that moment onward, the fish sector stopped looking like a small agricultural niche. It began to resemble a sector capable of reshaping parts of the national food economy. At first, the shift seemed small. Then the sequence accelerated. The push toward expanding fish production had already begun under the National Agro-Pastoral Initiative. Reservoirs were identified. Cage farming started spreading. Operators cautiously tested the waters of a growing aquaculture sector. For a while, progress remained steady but limited. Then the bottleneck became impossible to ignore. Fish farmers across the country kept encountering the same constraint. Feed. Imported fish feed remained expensive and sometimes inconsistent in supply. Each delay slowed production cycles. Each price increase reduced margins. Gradually, it became clear that the sector could not reach its full potential while relying heavily on external supply. That realization triggered a strategic response. Plans were drawn up to create domestic fish feed production capacity. Instead of importing the most critical input in the production chain, Burkina Faso would begin manufacturing it locally. The idea was simple, but its implications were far-reaching. The first step materialized in Bobo-Dioulasso, where new industrial units dedicated to producing fish feed were officially launched. These facilities were designed to supply operators engaged in aquaculture across the country, lowering costs and ensuring that feed would be available when producers needed it most. Almost immediately, expectations began to shift. Producers who had been hesitant about expanding cage systems suddenly saw the possibility of more stable operations. Entrepreneurs who had watched the sector from the sidelines began considering entry. Access to affordable feed meant the economics of fish farming could change dramatically. But the initiative did not stop there. Another similar unit was planned in Bagré, one of the country's major reservoir zones. By positioning production closer to aquaculture hubs, authorities hoped to shorten supply chains and reduce logistical costs even further. Within a short period, the narrative around the sector began to change. What had once been a fragmented industry dependent on imports started to look like a coordinated national effort. And that shift was closely tied to the broader development strategy promoted during the leadership period associated with Ibrahim Traoré, where increasing domestic production is presented as central to economic resilience. The timeline now showed a clear progression. First, aquaculture expansion. Then, recognition of the feed bottleneck. Next, the creation of domestic production facilities. And finally, the expectation that the entire sector could scale toward the national target of 100,000 tons of fish production. What began as a technical solution was quickly becoming something much larger, a restructuring of the production chain itself. But the most revealing part of the story appears when the numbers behind this transformation are examined closely. Before looking at the broader implications, it helps to pause and examine the numbers that define the scale of this initiative. The first figure sets the baseline. Burkina Faso's fish production currently stands at around 60,000 tons. That number represents the level the country has already achieved through expanding aquaculture, introducing floating cages across reservoirs, and encouraging operators to invest in fish farming. It means the sector is no longer experimental, it is already producing tens of thousands of tons of fish each year. But the second number explains why new infrastructure is being built. The national objective tied to the agropastoral offensive is 100,000 tons of fish production. That target implies a significant expansion beyond current output. Reaching it requires not only more fish farmers, but also stronger support systems throughout the entire production chain. The difference between those two figures 40,000 additional tons reveals the scale of growth planners are aiming for. That gap cannot be closed simply by adding more cages to reservoirs. It requires a reliable supply of inputs that allow fish farmers to scale production consistently. This is where fish feed becomes critical. In aquaculture, feed often represents the largest operating cost. Producers face multiple risks at once: higher prices, transport delays, and exposure to fluctuations in international supply. Each of those pressures limits the ability of fish farmers to expand operations. The new industrial units address that exact problem. By producing feed domestically in locations such as Bobo-Dioulasso, the country can reduce dependence on imported supplies. If feed becomes more accessible and more affordable, the economics of fish farming change quickly. Producers can raise larger volumes while maintaining stable production costs. Another indicator of the sector's expansion appears in the number of water sites now hosting aquaculture systems. Across Burkina Faso, nearly 20 reservoirs and dams already support floating cage operations. Each site represents potential capacity that can expand further if input supply remains reliable. Taken together, these numbers tell a simple but powerful story. Production already stands at 60,000 tons. The national goal is 100,000. Nearly 20 water bodies host aquaculture systems. And new feed factories are beginning to supply the most important input for the entire industry. When viewed in isolation, each figure seems modest. But placed side by side, they reveal a coordinated attempt to scale an entire food production sector. And that is why the inauguration of these facilities is often framed as part of the broader development direction associated with Ibrahim Traoré, where strengthening domestic production is seen as a path toward greater food security and economic resilience. Once those numbers are understood, the next question naturally emerges: how do critics and supporters interpret this strategy differently? Whenever a new development strategy appears, different interpretations quickly follow. The expansion of Burkina Faso's aquaculture sector is no exception. Some observers argue that projects like domestic fish feed factories may not transform the sector as dramatically as supporters expect. Fish farming still requires skilled operators, stable financing, and consistent management across dozens of reservoirs. Critics often note that agricultural modernization projects around the world sometimes launch with enthusiasm but slow down when long-term operational challenges appear. There is also a broader economic argument raised by skeptics. They suggest that building local feed production facilities might reduce import dependence, but it does not automatically ensure competitiveness. Domestic factories must still maintain quality standards, control production costs, and operate efficiently enough to serve a growing network of fish farmers. If those conditions are not maintained, the sector could struggle to scale at the pace policymakers hope. These concerns are not unusual in development debates. They reflect the reality that transforming a food production system is rarely simple. However, supporters of the initiative point to several factors that suggest the current effort may follow a different trajectory. First, the demand side of the equation is already strong. Fish consumption across the country remains significant, and domestic production has historically struggled to keep up with demand. That gap creates a natural market for expanding aquaculture. Second, the sector has already demonstrated early momentum. The presence of floating cages across nearly 20 reservoirs indicates that producers are actively experimenting with new aquaculture models rather than waiting passively for government programs to succeed. Third, the strategy addresses a very specific constraint rather than attempting to overhaul everything at once. By targeting the availability of fish feed, the initiative focuses on one of the most critical inputs in aquaculture production. Within this framework, supporters often connect the project to the broader development direction promoted during the leadership period associated with Ibrahim Traoré, emphasizing domestic capacity building as a long-term priority. When both perspectives are placed side by side, the debate becomes clearer. One side questions whether infrastructure alone can transform an industry. The other argues that removing a key bottleneck may unlock growth that was already waiting to happen. And it is precisely at this point in the story that an unexpected turning point begins to appear. Everything seemed technical until the strategy became clearer. The inauguration of the fish feed units revealed something larger than a simple industrial project. Aquaculture expansion in Burkina Faso had been limited by one fragile link in the chain: feed supply. Once that link begins to stabilize, the entire production system can move differently. The launch of the facility in Bobo-Dioulasso, combined with the planned unit in Bagré, signals the start of a domestic supply network rather than a single isolated factory. The intention is to anchor the most critical input inside the national economy. That shift changes the dynamics of the sector almost immediately. Fish farmers gain predictable access to feed, production planning becomes easier, costs become more stable. Gradually, aquaculture operations that once expanded cautiously may begin scaling faster. Supporters of the initiative argue that this is exactly the kind of structural change required if Burkina Faso hopes to close the gap between current production, about 60,000 tons, and the national ambition of 100,000 tons. More importantly, the policy direction aligns with a broader narrative about domestic production capacity that has been repeatedly emphasized during the leadership period associated with Ibrahim Traoré. Entire sectors become more resilient to external shocks. In that sense, the midpoint of this story is not the factory itself. It is the realization that aquaculture may be transitioning from a promising experiment into a coordinated national industry. And once that possibility emerges, the next question becomes unavoidable: what happens when this transformation begins to affect the real world beyond production statistics? When the shift from imported feed to domestic production begins to take hold, the consequences move quickly beyond the factory gates. For the state, the expansion of aquaculture introduces both opportunity and responsibility. Food security has long been a strategic concern. An increasing domestic fish production reduces reliance on imports that can fluctuate in price or availability. If the sector successfully approaches the 100,000-ton target, policymakers gain a stronger buffer against supply disruptions while reinforcing the narrative of economic self-reliance promoted during the leadership period associated with Ibrahim Traoré. At the same time, managing this growth requires coordination between agricultural agencies, regional authorities, and infrastructure planners to ensure that reservoirs, logistics, and regulation keep pace with expansion. For businesses, especially those operating in agriculture and food supply chains, the implications are immediate. Fish farmers now face a different production environment if feed becomes consistently available at competitive prices. Entrepreneurs who previously hesitated to invest may see aquaculture as a viable commercial opportunity. Transport companies and processing facilities could also benefit from the ripple effect of a growing industry. As production scales, secondary sectors, cold storage, packaging, distribution may begin expanding alongside fish farming itself. The impact on ordinary citizens may be even more tangible. In many communities, fish remains a key source of protein and nutrition. Markets can become more stable and accessible. That means households may gain more reliable access to affordable fish while new employment opportunities appear in farming operations, feed manufacturing, transport, and local markets. For young workers especially, expanding agricultural sectors sometimes offer alternatives to migration or unemployment. Beyond national borders, the development also carries regional implications. If Burkina Faso succeeds in expanding its aquaculture capacity significantly, the country could strengthen its position within West African food markets. Neighboring countries facing similar supply pressures may watch closely to see whether the model proves sustainable. Regional trade networks could eventually integrate locally produced fish into cross-border markets. Taken together, these effects reveal something important. What began as a factory inauguration gradually unfolds into a transformation touching governance, business, households, and regional dynamics. The ripple spreads through every layer of the economy. And once those consequences are visible, attention naturally turns to the next question: how might the future of this sector unfold from here? The most likely path forward for Burkina Faso's aquaculture sector will be gradual expansion rather than sudden transformation. Domestic fish feed production could stabilize costs for producers and allow fish farmers to plan longer production cycles with greater confidence. As more reservoirs host floating cage systems, annual output may continue moving toward the 100,000-ton national target. Growth would likely remain uneven at first, but steady improvements in infrastructure and coordination could gradually strengthen the sector's overall stability. There is also a more optimistic possibility. If feed production remains efficient and demand from producers rises quickly, aquaculture could accelerate faster than expected. New entrepreneurs might enter the market, investment could flow into processing and distribution, and the sector could begin generating more jobs and income across multiple regions. In that scenario, the strategy associated with the leadership period of Ibrahim Traoré, focusing on strengthening domestic production, could begin showing visible results in both food availability and economic activity. Yet there is always a more difficult scenario to consider. If production costs rise, if logistics between feed factories and reservoirs become inefficient, or if operators struggle with technical management of large aquaculture systems, growth could slow. Industries built around agriculture often depend on consistent coordination between government programs, private investment, and local expertise. When those elements fall out of balance, expansion can stall. The key lesson is not predicting which path will dominate. The real challenge is remaining attentive to the signals that reveal which direction the sector is moving. Because the future of this initiative will ultimately depend less on announcements and more on how effectively each step is implemented. After looking at the broader trajectory, the most important question becomes more personal. What does this actually mean for the people watching and following stories like this one? For those who closely observe economic and development trends, changes like the expansion of aquaculture in Burkina Faso offer an early signal of how countries attempt to reshape their own food systems. People who actively follow these shifts often gain a clearer understanding of where opportunities, risks, and long-term transformations may appear. Staying informed about sectors like agriculture, energy, or food production provides a deeper lens for interpreting global economic change. Others may experience the effects more indirectly. Even if someone is not involved in agriculture, developments in food production influence markets, employment patterns, and regional stability. When countries strengthen domestic supply chains, the impact often spreads across transport networks, small businesses, and local communities. Understanding those connections helps people interpret economic headlines more accurately. There are also viewers who might feel distant from stories like this. Agricultural infrastructure in West Africa may seem far removed from daily life elsewhere. Yet global food systems are increasingly interconnected. Changes in one region can shape trade flows, market prices, and international cooperation in ways that gradually affect a much wider audience. In other words, understanding these developments is less about geography and more about awareness. And regardless of where someone lives, being aware of how countries attempt to strengthen their own economic foundations helps ensure that no one is completely surprised by the larger changes unfolding in the global economy. If initiatives like this are meant to achieve lasting impact, discussion eventually turns from analysis to implementation. What matters is the sequence of practical steps that turn policy intentions into measurable results. The first responsibility usually rests with national leadership and agricultural authorities. Their task is to ensure that newly launched feed production units operate consistently, maintain quality standards, and supply producers at competitive prices. within the broader strategy often associated with the leadership period of Ibrahim Traore, success would be measured by whether domestic feed actually reaches fish farmers reliably and whether national production continues climbing toward the 100,000-ton objective in the coming years. The second layer involves enterprises and operators within the aquaculture sector. Fish farmers, feed manufacturers, transport companies, and distributors all play a role in sustaining the industry. For businesses, the key actions involve maintaining efficient supply chains, adopting modern aquaculture practices, and investing in the infrastructure that allows production to scale. Progress can be measured through rising output, stable operating costs, and expanding participation for new producers entering the sector. The third step belongs to communities and individual participants in the economy. Farmers, technicians, traders, and local workers contribute to the system's stability by applying skills, maintaining equipment, and supporting local markets that distribute the final product. The success of the initiative will ultimately show itself in everyday indicators. More stable food supply, growing employment in aquaculture-related activities, and stronger local markets. In the end, strategies only become meaningful when each level policy, enterprise, and community moves in coordination. Because implementation, not intention, is what ultimately determines whether a development plan truly reshapes a nation's food system. Near the beginning of this story, one moment quietly stood out: the recognition that a single constraint, fish feed, had been holding back an entire sector. Once that obstacle was identified, a chain of decisions followed, leading to the launch of new production units and the possibility of a more self-sustaining aquaculture system. Looking back across the path we have followed, the journey moves through several stages. First came the realization that domestic fish production could play a larger role in national food security. Then came the expansion of aquaculture cages across reservoirs and dams. After that, attention shifted to the weakest point in the system, the dependence on imported feed. The strategy evolved toward building local industrial capacity. Within this broader transformation, the leadership period associated with Ibrahim Traore has often been connected to a focus on strengthening internal production systems. Supporters describe these initiatives as part of a longer effort to reduce structural dependence and reinforce economic resilience. Whether viewed through policy, agriculture, or industry, the same theme appears repeatedly: developing the ability to produce essential goods domestically. But beyond policy discussions, the story ultimately returns to something more human. It is about farmers placing cages in reservoirs, workers operating new factories, and families whose access to affordable food may depend on whether these efforts succeed. It is a reflection of how a country attempts to shape its own future. Sometimes, transformation begins with something as simple as producing the feed that helps fish grow. And from there, an entire system can begin to change. A nation reshapes its future one supply chain at a time. After following this story from its earliest signals to its broader implications, one thing becomes clear. Moments like this are rarely just about a single factory, a single sector, or a single policy announcement. They are about understanding how a country chooses to build its future. If the expansion of aquaculture in Burkina Faso continues, the effort could influence food supply, employment, and economic resilience for years to come. For many observers, the direction associated with the leadership period of Ibrahim Traore reflects a broader conversation about domestic production, self-reliance, and the role of agriculture in national development. But stories like this do not belong to policymakers alone. They belong to everyone who follows how societies adapt, innovate, and respond to challenges. When people share perspectives, question assumptions, and discuss developments like these openly, the conversation becomes richer and more meaningful. If this story made you think differently about how food systems, industry, and leadership intersect, it may be worth continuing the conversation with others who are also trying to understand what these changes mean. Because the most valuable discussions often begin with a simple question: what do you think the future of this strategy might look like?